April 7, 1945, the morning sun broke across the Philippine Sea like molten copper, and Major Thomas Buchanan McGuire Jr. pushed his P-38 Lightning into a steep climbing turn. His twin Allison engines screaming defiance at the Japanese Zeros below. At 24 years old, he had already become America's second highest scoring ace, with 38 confirmed kills painted in neat rows beneath his cockpit. The Japanese knew his aircraft by sight now, that distinctive twin-boom silhouette that had sent so many of their pilots spiraling into the ocean. They called him the fork-tailed devil, and they had learned to fear the sound of his approach. McGuire had transformed himself from an eager young pilot into a lethal aerial predator over 3 years of brutal Pacific combat. His journey had begun in modest circumstances in Ridgewood, New Jersey, where he was born on August 1, 1920. His father, a policeman who had died when Thomas was young, left behind a son with an iron determination to prove himself. That determination carried him through flying school and into the cockpit of one of America's most formidable fighters, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, a twin-engine, twin-boom aircraft that could outclimb, outrun, and outgun almost anything the Japanese threw into the air. According to military records preserved in the National Archives and referenced in numerous aviation history publications, including Pacific Air Combat by Eric Hamill, Guire's combat career exploded during the brutal campaigns of 1944. While stationed with the 475th Fighter Group in New Guinea and later the Philippines, he developed tactics that revolutionized P-38 combat doctrine. He understood that the Lightning's advantages lay not in turning with the nimble Japanese fighters but in using superior speed, firepower, and teamwork to control the engagement. His rivalry with Major Richard Ira Bong, America's highest-scoring ace with 40 victories, drove McGuire to push harder, fly more missions, and take calculated risks that other pilots wouldn't dare attempt. The two men were friends, but intensely competitive, each hunting for opportunities to surpass the other's score. Bong had recently been sent home by direct order of General George Churchill Kenney, commander of the Far East Air Forces, who feared losing such a valuable propaganda asset. It left McGuire as the leading active ace in the Pacific theater, hungry to claim the title of America's top ace for himself. Mick Guire's 38th victory had come just days earlier, a clean kill against a Japanese Oscar fighter that he'd caught climbing away from an attack on American bombers. He needed only 3 more confirmed kills to match Bong's record. And the skies over the Philippines were still thick with Japanese aircraft despite their deteriorating strategic position. Every morning McGuire climbed into his Lightning with the same thought burning in his mind: today might be the day he became America's greatest fighter pilot. But on this bright April morning he would make a decision that would end everything. The transformation of Thomas McGuire from ambitious cadet to deadly fighter pilot had been neither quick nor easy. After graduating from the Southeast Air Corps Training Center in 1942, he received his silver pilot wings and commission as a second lieutenant, eager to enter combat. The Army Air Forces sent him initially to Alaska, a backwater assignment that frustrated the aggressive young pilot. While other fighter pilots were engaging Japanese forces across the Pacific, McGuire spent months flying patrols over cold, empty ocean, never seeing an enemy aircraft. His break came in March 1943, when the Army Air Forces reassigned him to the 49th Fighter Group in the Southwest Pacific. Theater under General Douglas MacArthur's command, McGuire arrived in New Guinea, carrying extra baggage, a reputation for aggressive flying that bordered on recklessness, and an ego that rubbed some of his squadron mates the wrong way. The veterans of the Pacific Campaign, men who had been fighting since the dark days after Pearl Harbor, viewed him with skepticism. He would need to prove himself in combat before earning their respect. His first kill came on August 18, 1943, during a bomber escort mission over Wewak, New Guinea. McGuire spotted a formation of Japanese fighters climbing to intercept the American bombers and dove his P-38. Through a gap in their formation, his .450 caliber machine guns and single 20mm cannon tearing into a Zero from close range. The Japanese fighter came apart in midair, pieces spinning away in a cloud of debris and fire. McGuire had tasted combat and found he had a natural talent for it. Over the following months, he refined his skills through constant combat and careful study. Unlike some aces who relied primarily on instinct, McGuire approached aerial combat as a science to be mastered. He studied enemy tactics, analyzed his own gun camera footage frame by frame, and developed techniques specifically tailored to the P-38's unique characteristics. he discovered that the Lightning's heavy firepower, concentrated in the nose rather than the wings, allowed for devastating accuracy at ranges where enemy fighters expected to be safe. Military historians examining McGuire's combat reports, including those studied by the Air Force Historical Research Agency, note his evolution from aggressive but somewhat undisciplined pilot to tactical mastermind. By mid-1944, he was leading formations and teaching other pilots his hard-won lessons. His signature tactic involved using altitude advantage to position his flight above enemy formations, then executing high-speed diving attacks that gave the Japanese no time to maneuver defensively. He would strike, destroy his target, and use his speed to climb back to safety before other enemy fighters could react. His score climbed steadily through 1944, 3 kills in October. For more in November, and then an extraordinary performance on December 25th and 26th, when he shot down 7 Japanese aircraft during the American landings at Mindoro in the Philippines. Those 2 days of combat, Christmas 1944, elevated McGuire into the elite ranks of America's top aces and brought him within reach of Bong's record. The relationship between Thomas McGuire and Richard Bong defined much of the final year of each man's combat career. Bong, a mild-mannered farm boy from Wisconsin, had begun his scoring before McGuire arrived in theater, but by late 1944, the aggressive New Jerseyan was closing the gap with alarming speed. The two men represented different philosophies of aerial combat. Bong was naturally gifted, almost instinctive in his flying, while McGuire was calculated, disciplined, and intensely competitive. General Kenny watched both men with a mixture of pride and concern. As documented in his memoir General Kenny Reports, published after the war, he recognized their value not just as fighter pilots, but as symbols that inspired other airmen and captured the imagination of the American public hungry for heroes. War correspondents followed both aces, and their scores were reported in newspapers across the United States. Mothers named their sons after them, and their faces appeared on recruiting posters. But Kenny also understood the psychological pressure building on both men. The competition to become America's top ace was driving them to take risks that increased with each kill. After Bong reached his 40th victory in December 1944, Kenny made a difficult decision. He ordered the ace home, officially to serve as a gunnery instructor, but really to preserve his life. Bong had beaten the odds too many times already, and Kenny feared that continued combat operations would inevitably result in his death. That left McGuire as the theater's top active ace, and the pressure on him intensified dramatically. He had 38 confirmed kills, tantalizingly close to Bong's record, but each additional victory became harder to achieve. The Japanese, battered and increasingly desperate, had fewer experienced pilots in the air. Many of the easy targets, the poorly trained replacement pilots, had already been shot down. What remained were either the very inexperienced or the very dangerous, veterans who had survived years of combat and knew every trick. McGuire's personality made this pressure even more acute. Fellow pilots who served with him described him as driven, almost obsessed with achieving ace status and then surpassing it. He flew more missions than required, volunteered for dangerous assignments, and pushed his aircraft and himself to their limits. Some viewed this as admirable dedication. Others worried it represented a dangerous loss of perspective. In early January 1945, McGuire led a fighter sweep over Negros Island in the Philippines, hoping to encounter Japanese aircraft defending their remaining bases. The mission found target several Japanese fighters that attacked the American formation. In the swirling dogfight that followed, McGuire demonstrated the skills that had made him legendary. Maneuvering his Lightning through a vertical scissors maneuver that positioned him perfectly behind a Japanese Oscar, his concentrated nose armament shredded the enemy fighter in seconds. But something had shifted in McGuire's approach to combat. Fellow pilots noticed he was taking chances he wouldn't have considered months earlier. Pursuing Japanese aircraft deeper into their own territory, breaking formation to chase individual targets, and staying in combat zones longer than tactical necessity required. The mission briefing on the morning of January 7th, 1945, should have been routine. McGuire and 3 other P-38 pilots, Major Jack Rittmeyer, Captain Edwin Weaver, and Second Lieutenant Douglas Throp, were assigned a fighter sweep over Negros Island. It's an area where intelligence indicated Japanese aircraft might be operating. The 4 Lightnings would patrol at medium altitude, engage any enemy aircraft they encountered, and returned to base at Dulag Airfield on Leyte. McGuire's Lightning that morning carried something unusual: 2 external fuel tanks still attached to the wings. Standard procedure called for pilots to jettison these tanks before entering combat. As they created additional drag and made the aircraft less maneuverable, the tanks were designed with quick-release mechanisms specifically so pilots could drop them instantly when enemy fighters appeared. But they also extended the Lightning's range significantly, allowing pilots to penetrate deeper into enemy territory and spend more time in the combat zone. The 4 P-38s lifted off from Dulag shortly after dawn, forming up in a loose combat spread that allowed each pilot to watch the others' blind spots while maintaining enough separation to maneuver independently. McGuire led the formation west across the Philippine Sea, toward Negros, climbing to 15,000 feet as they approached the island. Below them, the morning haze was beginning to burn off, revealing the green jungle canopy and occasional clearings where Japanese forces maintained hidden bases. Approximately 10 minutes into their patrol over Negros, Weaver spotted a single Japanese aircraft below them, a Kawasaki Ki-61 Heen, known to the Americans as Tony, one of Japan's more capable fighters. The Japanese pilot appeared to be alone, flying a lazy patrol pattern at about 7,000 feet, apparently unaware of the 4 American fighters above him. It was exactly the kind of target McGuire had been hunting. What McGuire didn't know and what would prove fatal was that the lone Japanese fighter was bait. Hidden in the clouds above the apparent target were several more Japanese fighters, using their solitary comrade to lure the Americans into an ambush. This tactic had worked for the Japanese before. Exploiting the aggressive nature of American fighter pilots who were eager to increase their scores, McGuire made his decision instantly, rolling his Lightning into a diving attack toward the lone Japanese fighter below. But instead of first jettisoning his external fuel tanks as doctrine required, he kept them attached, perhaps thinking the engagement would be quick: a single diving pass, a burst of gunfire, and another victory to add to his score. It was a small deviation from standard procedure, the kind of shortcut that experienced pilots sometimes took when they judged the risk to be minimal. His 3 wingmen followed him down, maintaining their formation discipline even as they matched his steep dive toward the target. The Japanese pilot below suddenly began maneuvering erratically, the universal signal that he had spotted the threat diving toward him. The ambush revealed itself with devastating suddenness, as McGuire's flight committed to their diving attack on the apparently isolated Japanese fighter. 3 more Ki-61s dove out of the clouds above them, their pilots expertly timed to catch the Americans in the vulnerable moment when they were focused on the decoy below. The hunter had become the hunted in seconds. Radio discipline dissolved as American voices crackled across the tactical frequency: bandits high, break left, they're all over us. McGuire's carefully planned attack disintegrated into a chaotic dogfight, with 4 American P-38s suddenly fighting for survival against 4 Japanese fighters who had chosen the time, place, and geometry of the engagement. The P-38 Lightning normally held significant advantages over the Japanese Ki-61: more speed, heavier firepower, and superior climb rate. But those advantages assumed the American pilots had prepared their aircraft for combat by jettisoning external fuel tanks and maintained the initiative in the engagement. McGuire's flight had neither advantage now. Their external tanks created drag that reduced maneuverability by nearly 30%, and the Japanese had achieved perfect positioning to attack. McGuire recognized his error immediately and reached for the tank release, but combat had evolved too quickly. A Japanese fighter was already settling onto his tail, its nose winking with gunfire. McGuire yanked his Lightning into a hard left turn, trying to bring his own guns to bear. But the external fuel tanks made his aircraft sluggish, responding with agonizing slowness to his control inputs. The fundamental rule of aerial combat: maintain your energy state, was working against him now. Energy in a dogfight means altitude and speed, the 2 factors that allow a pilot to dictate engagement terms. The Americans had traded both advantages for an ill-considered attack on a decoy target, and now they were paying the price. Rittmeier managed to get behind one of the Japanese fighters and fired a long burst that scored hits along its wing, but couldn't finish the kill before another Japanese fighter forced him defensive. Weaver and Throp were fighting their own battles, trying to protect each other while dealing with their own attackers. The neat 4-plane formation had dissolved into individual struggles for survival. McGuire found himself in a turning fight with the Japanese flight leader, both aircraft circling each other in an ever-tightening spiral. Each pilot trying to reduce his turn radius enough to bring guns to bear on his opponent. This was exactly the kind of fight the Lightning was supposed to avoid: a slow speed, sustained turning engagement where the more nimble Japanese fighter held the advantage. The altimeter unwound steadily as both aircraft descended through the turn: 10,000 feet, 8,000, 6,000. McGuire was dimly aware that he was running out of altitude, but breaking off the engagement now would expose his aircraft's vulnerable tail to enemy guns. He tightened his turn further, feeling the Lightning shudder as it approached its stall speed. At 3,000 feet, McGuire made his decision. He would brake hard, down, and away, accepting the risk of exposing his aircraft briefly in exchange for speed that would carry him out of the engagement zone. McGuire's combat experience told him that 3,000 feet was approaching minimum altitude for safe maneuvering in a dogfight, especially with an aircraft compromised by external tanks. But that same experience had also taught him that the Japanese pilot behind him would expect any brake maneuver to be upward or level, using the Lightning's superior speed to escape. So McGuire did something unexpected. He broke hard down and to the right, a radical maneuver designed to surprise his pursuer and generate separation through sheer audacity. The P-38 Lightning was a stable aircraft in most flight regimes, but it had one notorious characteristic that every Lightning pilot learned too: respect compressibility in high-speed dives. The thick wing design that gave the aircraft excellent high-altitude performance also created problems when diving at high speeds, particularly below 10,000 feet where air density increased. In steep dives, the air flowing over the wing could approach sonic speeds even when the aircraft itself was subsonic, creating shock waves that could lock the controls or make the aircraft difficult to manage. McGuire's dive, however, wasn't fast enough to trigger compressibility issues. His problem was different and more fundamental. He still had those external fuel tanks attached, and they were making his aircraft handle like a truck with square wheels. When he attempted to pull out of his dive at approximately 1,000 feet, the Lightning responded sluggishly, its nose coming up, but not fast enough. Not with the authority he expected from an aircraft he had flown in hundreds of combat missions. The jungle canopy below rushed up with terrifying speed. McGuire pulled harder on the control yoke, feeling the Lightning shudder as it strained against the forces he was demanding from it. He needed just a few more seconds, just enough time for the nose to come up and the aircraft to transition from its dive back into level flight. The P-38's twin Allison engines screamed at full power, trying to drive the aircraft through the pullout. At 300 feet, McGuire's Lightning stalled. The physics were unforgiving: an aircraft at low altitude in a high-G pullout, with external stores disrupting its aerodynamics, approaching its critical angle of attack. The wings simply stopped generating enough lift to sustain flight, and the 20,000-pound fighter began to drop, despite McGuire's desperate control inputs. There was no time to react. No altitude reserved for recovery. The P-38 struck the jungle canopy at a shallow angle, its twin booms catching in the trees and ripping away from the central nacelle as the aircraft disintegrated. The crash site would later be described by recovery teams as a debris field more than a recognizable crash pieces of aircraft, scattered across several hundred yards of dense jungle, the twin engines torn from their mounts, the cockpit crushed beyond recognition. Major Thomas Buchanan McGuire, Jr., America's second highest scoring ace with 38 confirmed victories, was killed instantly. He was 24 years old, just 41 days past his last birthday. The three surviving P-38 pilots fought their way clear of the ambush and returned to Dulag Airfield with the devastating news. Major Rittmeyer landed first, his Lightning showing bullet damage along one wing, and immediately sought out the squadron operations officer to report that McGuire had gone down.
Ow.
The news spread through the fighter group and then throughout the 5th Air Force command structure. General Kenny received the notification in his headquarters at Manila and later wrote in his diary that it felt like losing a son. The general had watched McGuire develop from an aggressive but raw pilot into one of the Pacific Theater's most effective fighter leaders. Kenny had believed McGuire might actually survive the war, might make it home to become one of the peacetime Air Force's leaders, carrying lessons learned in brutal combat into the post-war era. Instead, Kenny now faced the task of writing condolence letters to Mick Geyer's widow, Marilyn. To his mother, to the squadron and group personnel who had served under the A's, the general also had to confront his own decisions. Should he have sent McGuire home after the pilot had reached 30 kills, as some advisors had suggested? Should he have been more aggressive about enforcing mission rules and limiting the risks his top aces were taking? Search and rescue operations began immediately, with aircraft flying over the crash area hoping to spot survivors or wreckage that might indicate someone had parachuted clear. But the jungle was too dense, and the crash site itself was in territory still contested by Japanese forces. No parachute was spotted, no emergency radio signals received. The other pilots in the formation reported seeing Mick Geyer's Lightning strike the jungle and disintegrate. There was virtually no chance anyone could have survived. The official investigation into Mick Geyer's death began within days, with officers interviewing the surviving pilots and examining Mick Geyer's mission planning documents. The findings were straightforward and damning. McGuire had violated standing orders by entering combat with external fuel tanks still attached. It allowed himself to be drawn into a low-altitude engagement that sacrificed the P-38's natural advantages and had attempted a recovery maneuver at insufficient altitude. But the investigators also noted mitigating factors. The Japanese ambush had been expertly executed, using tactics specifically designed to exploit American fighter pilot aggression. The battle had developed with extreme rapidity, giving McGuire only seconds to make critical decisions. And McGuire had been flying his 13th consecutive day of combat operations, a pace that likely contributed to degraded judgment and increased risk-taking. The official report concluded with a recommendation that would echo through fighter doctrine for decades: squadron commanders should enforce stricter limits on continuous combat operations, and even elite pilots should be rotated out of combat zones periodically to prevent the accumulation of stress and fatigue that led to poor decision-making. The recovery of Mick Geyer's remains would take months and require the efforts of military personnel who specialized in the grim work of crash site investigation. The Japanese forces on Negroes Island remained active and dangerous through the early months of 1945, making it impossible to reach the crash site immediately. Only after Filipino guerrilla forces secured the area in March did American recovery teams venture into the jungle to locate what remained of Mick Geyer's aircraft. What they found confirmed the witness accounts. The P-38 had struck the jungle at high speed and low angle, integrating on impact. The twin booms had separated from the central nacelle, and the cockpit had been crushed by the violent deceleration and subsequent impact with trees. Recovery teams worked carefully through the debris field, documenting each piece of wreckage and collecting human remains for positive identification and burial with full military honors. The investigation also examined Mick Geyer's decision-making in the minutes before the crash, trying to understand what had driven an experienced combat pilot to violate basic tactical doctrine. Interviews with squadron mates revealed a man under enormous pressure, both self-imposed and external. McGuire had spoken frequently about his desire to break Bong's record, about proving himself the best fighter pilot in the Pacific, about making his mark before the war ended. Fellow pilots described how Mick Geyer's personality had shifted in the final months of 1944. The calculating tactical leader had become increasingly impulsive, taking chances that his earlier self would have rejected. Some attributed this to combat fatigue. McGuire had flown more than 400 combat hours, engaged in dozens of dogfights, and witnessed the deaths of numerous squadron mates. The psychological toll of sustained combat operations was not well understood in 1945, but its effects were becoming increasingly apparent in pilots who had been fighting since early in the war. The investigation also examined the aircraft's maintenance records, looking for any mechanical issues that might have contributed to the crash. The review found nothing. McGuire's Lightning had been in excellent condition, with no known mechanical defects or deferred maintenance items. The aircraft had performed exactly as designed. It was the pilot's decisions that had led to the fatal outcome. One particularly revealing piece of evidence came from Mick Geyer's personal effects recovered from his quarters, a letter he had written to his wife Marilyn but not yet mailed. In it, he expressed frustration with the pace of combat operations and the difficulty of finding Japanese aircraft to engage. He wrote about his determination to break Bong's record and his fear that the war would end before he could achieve that goal. The letter painted a picture of a man driven by ambition and pride, willing to take risks to achieve his objective. The final investigation report, completed in April 1945, concluded that McGuire's death resulted from pilot error compounded by tactical mistakes. But it also acknowledged the extraordinary pressures placed on elite combat pilots and recommended changes to how the Army Air Forces managed its aces. Despite the circumstances of his death, the Army Air Forces moved quickly to recognize McGuire's extraordinary combat record. General Douglas MacArthur personally approved the recommendation that McGuire be awarded the Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration, for his actions during combat operations in December 1944. The Medal of Honor citation specifically referenced McGuire's performance on December 25 and 26, when he had shot down 7 Japanese aircraft while protecting American invasion forces at Mindoro. The citation described how McGuire had repeatedly engaged superior numbers of enemy aircraft, demonstrating exceptional flying skill and aggressive leadership that inspired other pilots in his squadron. The medal was presented posthumously to Marilyn McGuire in a ceremony at the Pentagon in March 1946. McGuire's legacy extended far beyond his combat record. The Army Air Forces, and later the independent United States Air Force established in 1947, studied his tactical innovations and incorporated them into fighter pilot training programs. His emphasis on teamwork, energy management, and exploiting the specific advantages of American aircraft became core principles of Air Force fighter doctrine. In 1948, Fort Dix Army Air Base in New Jersey was renamed McGuire Air Force Base in his honor. The sprawling installation located near McGuire's childhood home became one of the Air Force's major logistics hubs and served as a tangible reminder of the young pilot's sacrifice. The base would host millions of personnel and thousands of aircraft over subsequent decades, each operation carrying forward the legacy of the ace whose name graced its gates. But perhaps the most significant legacy was the lesson McGuire's death taught about the psychology of combat and the dangers of unchecked ambition. Military psychologists studying pilot performance in the post-war years frequently referenced McGuire's case as an example of how competitive pressure and the desire for recognition could compromise even experienced combat veterans' judgment. His death helped drive the development of more sophisticated approaches to managing combat stress and preventing the kind of risk accumulation that had contributed to his fatal crash. Aviation historians and writers have returned to McGuire's story repeatedly over the decades since his death. His combat record stands among the most impressive of World War II. His tactical innovations influenced fighter combat doctrine well into the jet age. Yet his death also serves as a cautionary tale about the limits of human performance under extreme stress and the importance of maintaining discipline even in the heat of combat. McGuire's widow Marilyn never remarried, preserving her husband's memory until her own death in 2006. She donated many of his personal effects and papers to military museums and archives, ensuring that future generations could study not just his victories, but also the human story behind them. The death of Thomas McGuire Jr. marked a turning point in how the American military managed its elite combat personnel. The loss of 2 of the Pacific Theater's top aces, Bong would die in a test flight accident just months after returning home within a short period, shocked military leadership and forced a reassessment of policies regarding combat rotation and psychological support for pilots under extreme stress. In the decades following World War II, military researchers examined the phenomenon of victory disease, the dangerous combination of overconfidence, competitive pressure, and degraded judgment that could affect even the most skilled combat pilots. McGuire's final mission provided a textbook case study. Here was a pilot with 38 confirmed victories, hundreds of hours of combat experience, and recognized tactical expertise. Yet he made a series of fundamental errors that a rookie fresh from flight school should have avoided. The lessons drawn from McGuire's death influenced how the United States Air Force approached fighter operations in subsequent conflicts. During the Korean War, the Air Force implemented stricter rotation policies and established formal limits on continuous combat operations. Pilots were monitored for signs of combat fatigue, and aggressive rotation schedules ensured that even aces were sent to rear areas for rest before stress and fatigue compromised their effectiveness. Modern fighter pilot training includes detailed case studies of McGuire's final mission, It's not to disparage his memory, but to illustrate eternal truths about aerial combat. Instructors emphasize that fundamental procedures like jettisoning external stores before engaging exist for vital reasons and cannot be ignored, regardless of pilot experience or confidence. They point out that McGuire's death occurred not during his first combat mission or his 10th, but his hundreds-plus mission, demonstrating that experience alone doesn't provide immunity from fatal errors. The psychological dimension of McGuire's story continues to resonate with military personnel across services and eras. His drive to excel, his competitive nature, and his determination to prove himself as the best represent qualities that the military actively seeks in its personnel. Yet his death demonstrates how those same qualities, when unchecked by proper oversight and rest, can become liabilities rather than assets. From a historical perspective, McGuire's 38 victories stand as testament to remarkable skill and courage. He flew his P-38 Lightning against determined opponents in some of the Pacific War's most intense aerial battles. He developed innovative tactics that saved American lives and destroyed enemy aircraft. He trained younger pilots and led by example, demonstrating the aggressive spirit that won the air superiority battle in the Pacific. But January 7, 1945, also demonstrated that even the most skilled warriors are human, subject to fatigue, stress, and errors in judgment. McGuire's death in the jungles of Negroes Island, flying at 300 feet with his aircraft compromised by tanks he should have jettisoned, breaking orders in pursuit of one more victory, stands as a permanent reminder that courage without discipline and ambition without wisdom can prove as fatal as enemy fire. Today, McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey continues to bear his name, and historians continue to study his combat record. He remains America's second highest scoring ace of World War II, forever just 2 victories short of the record he sought so desperately. His name is inscribed on memorials alongside other great aces of that era, and aviation museums display his medals and combat photographs. The P-38 Lightning he flew so brilliantly survives in museums and air shows, its distinctive silhouette forever associated with the pilots like McGuire who flew it into combat. The story of Thomas McGuire Jr. ultimately transcends simple accounts of victories and defeats. It speaks to fundamental questions about ambition, discipline, leadership, and the price of war. His 38 victories saved countless American lives and contributed to the eventual Allied victory in the Pacific. His final mission cost one exceptionally talented pilot his life, but taught lessons that would save many others in conflicts to come. Both the triumphs and the tragedy deserve remembrance, for both contain truth about the nature of combat and the warriors who wage it.